Have you ever found yourself in a debate where the other person sounds confident, but you can tell they haven't actually done the work? Like they're tossing around big claims about faith, science, or history, but when you ask a real question, it's all vibes and no verification. Yeah, me too. That's why I use something that I call a claim calibration framework. It's a simple way to separate speculation from substance and find out if a claim is worth your time or just well-dressed noise. In this video, I'm going to walk you through a process I use every time I hear a claim, especially from Christian apologists, not to own anybody, not to be dismissive, but to ask an honest question. How far has this person actually thought this through? Are they offering insight or just repeating what they were taught to say? Because not all confidence is earned. Some of it is just indoctrination dressed up as depth, pseudo-intelligence that sounds smart but collapses under the weight of real questions. That's where this claim calibration framework comes in. It's a simple structure that helps me assess where someone is on the thinking journey, how much real evidence they've engaged with, and how seriously we should take the claim before we engage, debate, or deconstruct it. One of the biggest threats to real progress isn't just ignorance, it's pseudo-intelligence. People who speak with confidence, quote a few big names, maybe drop some ancient Greek, and suddenly they're treated like experts. But confidence isn't comprehension, and repetition isn't research. Most of what gets platformed in religious debate culture isn't real inquiry. It's indoctrination wrapped in performance. Pre-packaged arguments, rhetorical tricks, emotional stories rehearsed to shut down critical thinking. And here's the problem. When we give these voices equal weight in conversations about truth, justice, science, or ethics, we elevate noise to the level of knowledge. We waste time debating people who haven't done the work and legitimize worldviews that haven't earned that seat at the table. That's why claim calibration isn't just a personal tool, it's a cultural filter. It helps us stop mistaking performance for proof and indoctrination for insight. It protects our time, our attention, and our audience from giving credibility to claims that haven't passed basic intellectual checks. In a world flooded with recycled talking points and unexamined certainties, we need better tools, not just to protect our time, but to protect our minds. So before we break down any claims, let's unpack a framework that helps us filter the noise from the knowledge. So how do we tell the difference between someone who's done real work and someone who's just parroting what they've been told? That's where the stages of inquiry come in. It's not just a ladder of learning, it's a credibility filter. The deeper someone has gone in the process of inquiry, the more weight their claim deserves. And the shallower their process, the more we treat their certainty with skepticism. Because the validity of a claim doesn't just rest in what is said, it also rests in how someone arrived to that conclusion. This framework lets us ask, are they simply speculating? Have they studied both sides? Have they formed and tested a real hypothesis? Or are they just delivering beliefs with academic cosplay? Let's walk through the stages from speculation to fact and explore how each one reveals not just knowledge, but intellectual sincerity. So first, there's speculation. That's the first stage of inquiry. It's the what if question. This is where most conversations start and where too many people stay. At this stage, someone is toying with an idea based on intuition, tradition, or vibes. It might come from a sermon, a TikTok, or a childhood memory, but there's not a real process behind it. Here's why it's dangerous. Speculation is fine if it's acknowledged as speculation, but when speculation gets platformed as fact, it becomes misinformation with the microphone. Now, the next phase is studying. This may be signaled by hearing someone say, I've read or listened to others on this. Now, this is where curiosity gets louder. The person starts seeking voices, reading books, watching videos. But here's the catch. Most people at this stage are still inside confirmation bubbles. They're studying to prove, not studying to learn. So what you want to watch out for at this level is surface level engagement, one-sided sources, and buzzwords without comprehension. It sounds educated, but it hasn't been tested yet. That third stage is hypothesis formation. Based on what I've learned, I think this might be the case. This is the tipping point. The person begins to synthesize ideas, not just repeat them. They form a tentative claim and start exploring if it holds up. Now, why does this matter? It shows original thought. It shows they're starting to take intellectual responsibility for what they believe. But without testing it, it's still just a theory in waiting. And then the next stage is experimentation or engagement. They say things like, I've tested the claim, cross-examined opposing views, and compared methodologies. This is where everything changes. This is where people stop protecting their belief and start interrogating it. They seek out the strongest counter-arguments. They don't just engage critics, they learn from them. This is real inquiry. And it's also rare because it requires humility, effort, and the willingness to be wrong. And then there's theory building. You'll hear things like, there's enough pattern in what I've tested to propose a framework. At this stage, the person isn't just reacting, they're constructing. They've seen enough repetition in data, behavior, or logic that they can offer an explanatory model. Now, why does this matter? Because theories are dynamic. They invite challenge, they grow, and they're miles ahead of the recycled one-liners we so often hear in religious debates. And then this last stage is fact recognition, which is typically provisional. You will hear things like, the data consistently validates this conclusion across contexts. This is the closest we get to truth in the real world, not because it's absolute, but because it's repeatable. It's held up under scrutiny across time with multiple lenses. But here's the key. Even here, we hold our conclusions with humility because knowledge isn't about domination. It's about discipline. Current knowledge doesn't provide certainty. It provides clarity. And facts aren't eternal. They're earned, tested, and held lightly until something better is proven. The deeper someone has traveled in this process, the more seriously we can and should take their claim. Not all beliefs are built equally, and not every voice deserves the same stage. Here's where this framework becomes more than just analysis. It becomes strategy. Because the point isn't to mock speculation or shame people who are early in the process. It's to calibrate our response based on how much intellectual investment the claim has actually earned. The weight I invest in a claim is directly proportional to the demonstrable depth of inquiry that led to it. In other words, if you've barely scratched the surface, I'm not going to act like you've hit bedrock. If your beliefs haven't been tested, I'm not about to treat them like they're proven. Speculation isn't disqualified, it's just unverified. And until it's verified, it doesn't get promoted to the same stage as real inquiry. This is how we protect our time. This is how we protect our community from platforming pseudo-intelligence as if it were wisdom. Because far too often, debates aren't about discovery, they're about dominance. And when we treat unexamined claims like they're on par with evidence-based frameworks, we legitimize performance as proof. This isn't about dismissing people, it's about defending the process of truth-seeking itself. So how do we know where someone really is on the inquiry spectrum? Because let's be honest, anyone can sound confident. But if we want to avoid wasting energy debating performance thinkers, we need to know what depth we're dealing with. Here are 5 techniques to reveal how far a person has actually traveled in their thinking and whether their claim is worth your time. Number 1, ask for source diversity. What are 3 types of sources you've consulted on this topic? This question checks for intellectual range. People stuck in speculation usually only reference one voice, a pastor, a YouTuber, or a favorite author. Real thinkers draw from multiple disciplines: history, science, linguistics, opposing theological schools. If their bookshelf or YouTube feed is just an echo chamber, they're not past stage 2. You can also probe for opposing views. What's the strongest argument against your position that you've seriously considered? This is the ego check. If someone can't name a strong counter argument, they're not defending a belief, they're avoiding a challenge. People past the hypothesis stage will welcome pushback and respect the other side, even if they disagree. Speculators, on the other hand, deflect, dismiss, or demonize. You can also invite methodology. How did you come to that conclusion? Did you compare data, sources, translations, or historical perspectives? This question checks whether their belief is a conclusion or just a conditioning. There's a difference between having a belief and arriving at one through a process. No methodology equals no depth. And if they can't articulate their reasoning, they're likely just reciting someone else's. You can also challenge with known contradictions or anomalies. So, how does your view account for insert contradiction or alternate source? This is a pressure test. People in deeper stages of inquiry have wrestled with tensions. They might not have all the answers, but they'll engage the challenge with curiosity and structure. Speculators, however, will change the subject, get hostile, or throw out canned apologetics without real engagement. You can also observe emotional response. You can often tell someone's inquiry stage by how they react to disagreement. People with depth have confidence without fragility. People in speculation have certainty without structure, which means their ego does the talking when their ideas get challenged. If critique feels like an attack, it means the belief isn't grounded, it's personal. And at that point, you're not having a conversation, you're tiptoeing around someone's identity crisis. The bottom line here is that depth can't be faked, not for long. These techniques help you separate bold thinkers from bold parrots. In a world where dogma is loud, these questions help you listen for signal and not just noise. When sincerity doesn't match the claim, the whole premise collapses. Here's the part most people miss, and it's not just philosophical, it's personal. Because once you've actually wrestled with the hard questions, not skimmed them, not dodged them, but sat with them, you realize something painful but liberating. If someone's sincerity of interest hasn't risen to the depth their claim demands, the whole premise falls apart for me. You can't claim absolute truth from a shallow process. You can't preach certainty if you've never survived real scrutiny. And I say that not just as an idea, but as someone who's been there. I've tested these claims. I've studied the manuscripts. I've compared translations, sat with contradictions, mapped out historical evolutions of doctrine and text, not to disprove, but to understand. And what I found was this: the more I investigated, the less I needed to keep going, because the claim unraveled itself under its own weight, not from bitterness, not from bias, from basic verification. This wasn't deconstruction by emotion, it was falsification by evidence. So no, you can't gaslight me into pretending I haven't done the work I've actually done. You can't sell me perfect preservation when I've beheld the fragments, read the redactions, and seen the edits with my own eyes. I didn't stop asking because I lost faith. I stopped because the inquiry reached a wall, and the wall was made of myth. That's not intellectual weakness, that's intellectual integrity. So as a case study, let's test the claim of perfect biblical preservation. Let's walk this through together using the Claim Calibration Framework, not to humiliate anyone, but to honestly assess where this claim stands and whether it deserves to be treated like a fact. So step one is to identify the nature of the claim. The claim is the Bible has been perfectly preserved for thousands of years. This isn't a personal reflection, it's a historical truth claim, asserting divine preservation through centuries of copying, translation, and transmission. That places it at the top tier of the framework. It's presented as a fact, which means it requires deep inquiry to validate. So, step two is to calibrate the claimant's inquiry depth. Now, let's break down what it looks like when people actually make this claim and where they tend to land on the framework. The first stage, of course, is speculation. So a person may say, I believe it's true, that's just what I was taught. In this case, no evidence is offered, there's no understanding of manuscript traditions, and there is high certainty but low substance. This is where most believers stop. But then you have the next stage, which is studying. Someone may say, I've read Josh McDowell, Lee Strobel, or watched some videos on biblical history, which does show that there's some effort to learn there, but they're only consulting apologetic sources which are curated to confirm belief. There's no interaction with textual criticism or secular scholarship. They're still living in an informational bubble, not real inquiry. But then some may make it to the hypothesis formation stage. They may say, I believe God protected the Bible because it's consistent with what I've learned so far. The person begins connection dots and forming personal conclusions, which is healthy, but they still haven't tested those conclusions against contradictions, redactions, or variants. They may reference manuscripts without actually understanding how they differ. They're thinking, but not yet verifying. And then there's the stage of experimentation and engagement. I've compared the Codex Sinaiticus, Vaticanus, and later manuscripts. I've studied how councils shape canon and how scribes introduce variants. Now, at that moment, this is real work. Textual criticism, comparative history, knowledge of things like the ending of Mark, short versus long, the Johannine coma, the evolution of key doctrines. Very few apologists reach this stage. If they did, the original claim would already be collapsing. And then there's the theory building stage. The evidence doesn't support perfect preservation, but I believe the general message has survived well enough to be theologically meaningful. Now, this is honest, this is thoughtful, and this is humble. But here's the catch. This is no longer the original claim. Perfect preservation is gone, replaced by something more nuanced. And then at that last stage, fact recognition, provisionally, someone may say there's no credible evidence of perfect preservation. The data shows a long history of variation, editing, and political influence. This conclusion is consistent with mainstream biblical scholarship. It reflects deep inquiry and falsification, but it contradicts the original claim entirely. Now, step 3 is you want to assess the sincerity of interest. The weight I give a claim is directly related to how far the claimant has progressed in active inquiry. Most apologists present stage 1 or 2 beliefs as if they've survived stage 6 testing. That's a credibility mismatch, and it matters. Try asking, what's the strongest counter evidence you've studied? Have you read any peer-reviewed scholarship that critiques biblical preservation? Or how do you reconcile verses quoted by early church fathers that don't exist in today's Bible? If they can't engage with those questions meaningfully, the depth isn't there. So the final calibration here, the claim is the Bible has been perfectly preserved. Tested depth is stage 1 or 2 at best, and is presented as stage 6. The credibility rating here is inflated, not trustworthy until tested through stage 4. Now, why does this matter? Because it's not about attacking belief. It's about protecting the integrity of dialogue. When someone makes a stage 6 claim but has only done stage 1 work, we owe it to truth and to ourselves to treat it accordingly. I guess my big conclusion here would be claim less, inquire more. So here's where we land. Not every claim deserves your energy, not every confident voice deserves a platform, and not every opinion deserves to be treated like truth, because truth isn't loud, it's earned through study, through pressure, through real inquiry. And when someone skips the steps and still demands stage 6 credibility for a stage 1 speculation, that's not confidence, that's counterfeit. But here's what I've learned, and maybe you have too. The more you do the work, the less noise can shake you. Because you've been down the rabbit hole. You've asked the hard questions, and you didn't stop because you were afraid of the answers. You stopped because the answers stopped making sense. You can't gaslight people out of lived investigation. You can't shame people out of a truth that they uncovered through blood, sweat, and citations. And you can't equate indoctrinated repetition with evidence-based conviction. So if you're watching this and you're on the journey, maybe still wrestling, maybe freshly deconstructed, remember this. The depth of your questions already tells me more about you than the certainty of someone else's answers. So keep going, stay curious, ask better questions, and most importantly, don't just respond to the claim, respond to the caliber of inquiry behind it. Because if the claim can't survive the process, it didn't deserve your belief in the first place. This is how we build beyond superstition, not with louder claims, but with deeper thinking. Thank you for joining me for this conversation today. If you're enjoying this content and itching for more like it, check out a few of my other videos on the screen. Until next time, keep rising.